to tell you all about all this stuff. What was actually happening that night, what everyone was so angry about, what the backlash was. Cliff Notes version, you had 8 British soldiers and their commanding officer against several hundred irate Bostonians clinging pretty much everything they could get their hands on. That evening ended well for nobody, but especially poorly for the 5 Bostonians who died when those 8 British soldiers finally decided enough was enough, and in self-defense, admittedly, opened fire into that crowd. Those were the first casualties of the American Revolution, but sadly, far from the last. Off to your right, you might notice the tea kettle above the Starbucks off to our right, and the steam pouring out of the spout. Every now and then we drive past this thing and nothing's happening. Hold that thought. Once wouldn't be a big deal. 3 times in a row, I might start wondering if that Starbucks was potentially in violation of its lease. Which would be a pity, because that Starbucks kind of has a good thing going there. That is a corner location right by City Hall. They want to keep it. They're supposed to keep that kettle intact, shiny, and operational. It's been steaming away in that general area since the 1870s, when it was first built as the emblem of the now long defunct Oriental Tea Company. To our left, I give you dead people. I'll have about 12,000 more of them for you in a block, but that is the oldest burial ground in the city. King's Chapel Burial Ground, like Boston itself, dates back to the year 1630, when a guy named John Winthrop, our first governor, who is buried in there, led a group of English Puritans down from Charlestown, which they had settled 1 year prior, to give us the city of Boston nearly 400 years ago. Have any of you heard of the Puritans before? Oh, okay, a couple of you. Have you heard anything good? What's that? Oh, you did? Really? Kind of a cool place. Did they tell you about the subway vent? There's a subway vent right in there. Old Town Trolley's Ghosts and Gravestone tour tries to dress that up like it's a gateway to the underworld or something. So the Green Line runs right underneath it. It's a ventilation duct. But no, I ask because the people who founded this city are mostly known today for belts around their hats, hunting witches, and hating fun. It's the same cuddly bunch that gave us the Salem witch trials in 1692 and banned Christmas here for 22 years. Things change in 400 years, but I wouldn't exactly say this was a party town early on. Now this is basically the Hollywood Walk of Fame for dead people in Boston. The old granary. Very center, there's a stone obelisk that says Franklin on it. Benjamin Franklin, the guy in the $100 bill, is not here. He's in Philadelphia. But we've got his parents, and right behind them is a noted North End silversmith, goldsmith, coppersmith, artist, shameless plagiarist, amateur dentist, and most famously of all, equestrian. Paul Revere undertook his famous Midnight Ride 250 years ago this past April. Those 3 are looking at the final resting place of a Boston lawyer named James Otis. If you ever heard the phrase, taxation without representation is tyranny, that was him. You've got all 5 victims of the Boston Massacre, and you've got 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence. Sam Adams, Robert Treat Paine, John Hancock. The first signer of the Declaration of Independence, also when he died, richest guy in Boston, is the tall fancy one in the back. The fact that he was the richest guy in Boston is why he got the fancy one. Now, this is one of 16 stops along a 2.5-mile long red brick walking path through the greatest hits of the American Revolution. We call the Freedom Trail. You can pick up one end of it at the Boston Common Visitor Center, which we'll be coming up on in just a couple blocks. I not dropped a number earlier, 12,000. That is the actual estimate for how many people are buried there. If it seems like a tight fit, thing to keep in mind, Boston, when it was first founded, was about a 40th the size of what we call Boston now. This is a map of Boston, dates back to circa 1770 or so. The old Shawmut Peninsula, all 1.1 square miles of it. Shawmut is an Algonquin Indian word. The local Massachusetts people that this state is named after who had been living in this area for about 6,000 years before the English showed up. For them, this was a very fertile seasonal fishing and hunting ground, but it was barely bigger than the North End is today. They got pretty efficient about using all the space they had, with the glaring exception of this thing, Boston Common. This was 50 acres of prime real estate, but in 1634, the Puritans set this aside as common land for the common good. Basically meant nobody would ever own this, but anybody could graze their cattle out here. Militia companies drilled here. There were public speeches, public sermons, only the occasional public hanging. Center of the action, basically. Oldest public park in the United States. However, if you note the bronze arms intertwined coming up off to our right, we call that statue the Embrace, and it's only been here for about 3 years. It's an artist's reimagining of a famous photograph, also called The Embrace, of Martin Luther King Jr. hugging his wife Coretta Scott at the news that he was being honored with the Nobel Prize back in 1965, which is lovely. But if any of you know anything about those two, you might be aware they were not from Boston. We have the statue because they met here as college students, which kind of fits. Because during the school year, roughly 1 in 3 people living in this city, comes to about 300,000, are living in this city because they are attending one of 36 colleges and universities you can find here. Couple blocks back, it was Suffolk University. Couple blocks more, it'll be New England Law Boston. There's Boston University. That's where King was earning his PhD, while Coretta Scott studied at the New England Conservatory of Music. You got Northeastern, Berkeley, Berkeley, nothing going to California, UMass Boston, Bunker Hill Community College, Wentworth, Simmons. About 2 weeks ago, somebody made a sad face when I didn't give Tufts a shout out. Tufts is a kind of. Some of that's here, you can kind of count it, but their main campus is out in Medford. If you're waiting for the exhaustive list, it's not going to happen off the top of my head, but it's a lot. If you notice, I didn't mention Harvard or MIT in that list. That's because they're not in Boston. Cambridge is close, but it's one town over. I didn't mention Boston College because that's not in Boston. Newton, next town over from Cambridge, along with LaSalle. I live one town over from that, Waltham, the Watch City, home to both Bentley and Brandeis. This whole state, New England in general, is lousy with colleges. That all kind of starts with the Puritans. This is where they deserve a little bit of credit. When they came out here to build their ideal religious society, part of that vision was everybody would know the Bible here, cover to cover. Kind of requires that you've read it. You can't read the Bible if you can't read, which most people couldn't back then. Education was such a priority of theirs that back in 1636, just across the river, it was the Puritans who gave us the first college in North America. They just called it the college for the first 2 years. You don't really have to specify when it's the only one around, but they rebranded 2 years later. Probably know that as Harvard University now. That's what got the ball rolling on pretty much everything else. Right now, we are driving through the campus of Emerson College. It's a performing arts school, pretty good one. It should be. We're right in the middle of the theater district. If you like live performances, this is pretty much where you go for that, Boston. Emerson owns a pretty major chunk of it. They don't have 6 U.S. presidents among their alumni like Harvard does, but if any of you know your comedians, Bill Burr, Jay Leno, Dennis Leary, they all came through here. What about Henry Winkler? Anyone ever heard of him before? Best known as someone named Arthur Fonzarelli from a little sitcom called Happy Days back in the 70s. Although I personally have always made the case that Happy Days was at best his second greatest professional achievement. In 1985, Henry Winkler became the executive producer of my favorite 80s TV show. Does anybody remember MacGyver? Okay. If you never had the pleasure, Angus MacGyver was an ex-soldier, specifically a U.S. Army Explosive Ordnance Disposal Technician, EODT. If you ever saw the first one, he was one of those guys. But when he fought the bad guys in his civilian life, he never used guns because guns are bush league. Any scrub can use a gun. A Swiss Army knife, that takes a legit badass. He would break out his Swiss Army knife. He would look around and whatever random junk he had lying around. Each and every week for 7 seasons, he would cobble all that together into some bonkers gadget to save the day. He once cuffed to an armored car with a blowtorch he'd made out of chewing gum and a rusty old bike. 30 years later, Richard Dean Anderson still remembered that as the dumbest thing he'd ever heard, but it was a great show. That was Henry Winkler. By the way, where we are now is kind of an important little dividing line. We are on Charles Street right now. It's called Charles Street because this is where the Charles River used to start. Everything to the west of that, this was all basically just water up until the latter half of the 19th century. It's why we call this neighborhood the Back Bay. Here, I showed you this earlier. This is the original city of Boston. It is a slightly more modern map of Boston. You got the original city right here, Charles River here. We are currently working our way through this light blue section. If you see light blue, it means it is part of Boston's land area today, but like 1/6 of that land area, roughly 5,000 acres. It is literally man-made from the ground up, filled in land. Basically, in 1857, the city of Boston purchased and then demolished a big old hill 9 miles south of here. It was called Needham Heights because it was in Needham, Massachusetts. Then they spent the next few decades bringing all that rubble up here by train, basically gradually worked their way west. They dumped it into the river until it wasn't the river anymore. They basically turned everything from here on for nearly 2 miles into land, and then they built everything you see around you on top of it. We just crossed over Arlington Street. Next we're going to turn right onto Berkeley. See, what they do is they would fill in just enough to lay down one street at a time. They would sell off housing plots on that street. That's how they would finance the fill-in and construction of the next one down. If we kept going, we would cross Clarendon, Dartmouth, Exeter, Fairfield, Gloucester, and Hereford streets. Then you get to Mass Ave. After that, you are in a neighborhood called the Back Bay Fens, home of Fenway Park. Fens is an old English word. It means stagnant water. So it used to be marshland out there. After that, that was only incorporated later, so kind of like the grid pattern you're seeing here kind of breaks down after that. But you would find Ipswich, Jersey, Kilmarnock, Lansdowne, and minor streets out there. Now, maybe not the most environmentally friendly approach for needing more space today, but they did make some pretty nice stuff out here. When we take this right turn over on Newbury Street, you should get a pretty nice look at the Church of the Covenant. It's the tallest church steeple in Boston, made out of something called Roxbury pudding stone, also known as church stone, because there are about 40 churches in the greater Boston area made out of this stuff. The official stone of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, apparently. If you dig hard enough, there's an official just about everything. Apparently you can only find this stuff in Massachusetts and just off the coast of Morocco, which sounded a little strange to me when I first heard that. I always figured wherever you go, the planet's all made out of basically the same stuff, but I don't know, something continental drift. You guys ever heard the name Nancy Kerrigan before? Famous figure skater. She was married in there. It's probably a happier moment of her life than the other one she's kind of famous for. Also, a bit off to our left, that red and brown building right there. Well, today that's basically a fancy furniture store. It's called Restoration Hardware. But up until 1949, that was the Museum of Science. They didn't run out of space there and move to their current location out on the Charles River Dam until 1951. That building, it used to have a twin. If we'd gotten about a block further up, there's an H&M over there. It used to have something called the Rogers Building. That was the original campus of MIT when it first started in Boston's Back Bay as Boston Tech. They didn't move out to Cambridge until 1916. But Arlington Street Church one of the first buildings that went up in this neighborhood back in 1861. You can still find vintage photographs of it rising up above pretty much absolutely nothing. I kind of like pointing out this church for a few reasons. Every now and then we have some friends from across the pond with us. Whenever we have anyone from Great Britain potentially feeling a little bit homesick, I always point that out because it was designed to resemble the St. Martin in the Fields Church over in Westminster. About 3 weeks ago, I had a Londoner on board. I mentioned that little tidbit. I looked up at it, and I believe his exact words were, "Yes, I see the attempt." Makes it feel all warm and fuzzy, doesn't it? Also in 2004, the first church and state-sanctioned same-sex marriage in the United States took place in there. Only one on the first day. It's Massachusetts, but I think they were still being a little cautious. They wanted to see what the backlash was to that before they did anything else. Wasn't much. People basically just said, what do you know, didn't rain for 40 days and 40 nights. I guess we're good. Day 3, they had 50, and they haven't really stopped since. Now this is the Boston Public Garden. It predates the Back Bay by about 20 years, but it's also mainland. It opened in 1837. It's the oldest botanical garden in the country today. What you're seeing through the the trees is something we call the Swan Pond, because it has been the home of Boston's famous swan boats ever since 1877. What you find in there from the beginning of April up until Labor Day is a fleet of 6 paddle boats, each with a pretty white swan figurehead. That will give you a lovely, scenic, relaxing 20-minute ride around that pond. You'd be supporting a local family business. It's still owned and operated by the same family, the Pagets, who started this almost 150 years ago. And while admittedly the price has gone up since then, probably not as much as you'd be expecting. It's about $5 a head. I always tell people, if you have kids with you, it's a good place to bring the family. If you don't have kids with you, it's a pretty popular place to bring a date here in Boston. It's a good way to make a good first impression without breaking the bank. That's pretty handy if you're, say, one of those 300,000 cash-strapped college kids we get every year. Also, not a terrible way to make a good 50th impression if you've been dropping the ball a little bit lately. Judgment-free duck. We all make mistakes. But that is Boston Common, directly ahead, once again, western edge of the original city. One thing I did not mention about it earlier was that at one time, half the British Army in Boston camped out here. And on the evening of April 18th, 1775, 700 of those British soldiers were sent out on a little secret mission by their overall commander, General Thomas Gage. They got on their boats right up there, Charles River, now Charles Street. They rowed their way across the river into Cambridge. They landed. They began their march through the night on the town of Concord, about 20 miles from here, with orders to seize or destroy a store of stolen weapons and ammunition that the ever bolder rebel scum had been stockpiling out there. Turned out that rebel scum had a pretty capable spy network. It was called the Committee of Public Safety. When they learned what the British were up to, they dispatched a number of riders out into the countryside, most famously Paul Revere, to warn everyone that they were coming. Around 5 in the morning, that British column marches into Lexington on their way to Concord, where they're confronted by 77 local militia. After a brief tense standoff, shots are fired. That is the beginning of the Revolutionary War, but that journey starts right there. By the way, off to your left, you might have to squint a little to see it, but out in front of the benches, can you guys make out the bronze ducks? There's a big one. It's being followed in a line by 8 little ones. That is Mama Mallard and her 8 kids. Jack, Tack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack. The kiddos were born a couple blocks that way on a little island out in the middle of the Charles River, but on a previous visit to the Swan Pond, Mr. and Mrs. Mallard noticed that folks riding those swan boats are in such a good mood that they're really generous throwing peanuts. Seems like a good place to raise a family. That is their new home. As soon as 8 baby ducks have dealt with Boston traffic. No bueno. Fortunately, they have befriended a local police officer named Michael, who was called ahead to have traffic blocked off in this intersection so that that family can make their way across Beacon Street onto the public garden. That is the plot of a children's book written back in 1942 called Make Way for Ducklings by an art student from Ohio named Robert McCloskey. who apparently was inspired by seeing an actual Boston police officer stopping traffic to let an actual family of ducks cross the street. He took a few creative liberties after that, but it's a charming read. If you ever want to check it out for free, make your way a little further into the Back Bay, find the Boston Public Library, second largest book collection in the United States, behind the Library of Congress. They have about 150 copies, and a library card is free.